At 11:23 a.m. on September 19, 1944, Private First Class Walter Kowalski crouched inside his M4 Sherman tank near Ericourt, France, with 3 German Panzer IV tanks closing from 800 yards. His hands were shaking. The loader before him had been killed 2 days ago when a Panzer round punched through their turret. Walter was a replacement, a mechanic. He had loaded exactly 4 training rounds in his entire life before this moment. The gunner next to him was screaming something about traverse speed. The commander above was yelling coordinates. The driver was reversing into a hedgerow. And Walter was supposed to load the 75mm shell into the breech. Fast. He grabbed the first shell from the ready rack, 38 pounds of high explosive. His hands were slick with sweat and oil. The proper method was drilled into every loader at Fort Knox. Grip the shell nose forward, line up the brass base with the breech, slam it home, step clear. The whole sequence took 4 seconds if you were good, 5 if you were nervous. Walter had watched loaders work. They always faced the breech head on. But Walter was left-handed, and in the cramped turret of a Sherman tank, that mattered. When he turned to face the breech properly, his left elbow smashed into the gunner's shoulder. The gunner shoved him, hard. The shell nearly slipped from his grip. The commander was screaming now. The Panzers were at 600 yards. Walter did something no training manual suggested. He turned his back to the breech, reached behind himself, felt for the opening with his left hand while his right gripped the shell base. His fingers found the rim of the breech. He guided the nose backward into the chamber, shoved hard. The breech mechanism caught, slammed shut. The gunner fired without a word. The recoil drove hot metal and smoke backward. It singed Walter's neck. He didn't care. He was already reaching for the next shell. Same motion, back turned. Left hand guiding, right hand ramming. 3 seconds. The breech closed, the gun fired. Walter's ears were ringing. Cordite burned his throat. 3rd shell, same backward method, 2.5 seconds. 4th shell, 2 seconds flat. The commander's voice cut through the noise. 4 impacts, 4 kills, 6 minutes of combat. The German tanks were burning in a field 400 yards away. The crew went silent. Walter stood there, back still turned to the breech, hands black with powder residue. The gunner stared at him. The commander climbed down from his hatch and looked at Walter like he'd grown a second head. Nobody loaded a 75mm cannon backward. It violated every safety protocol, every training procedure, every manual written since 1942. But it worked. And in that moment, Walter realized something the instructors at Fort Knox had never considered. What happened next would change how every Sherman crew in 3rd Army loaded their guns. The M4 Sherman tank that Walter Kowalski served in was not designed to fight German panzers head-to-head. It was designed in 1941 to support infantry, to break through defensive lines, to be reliable, easy to produce, and simple to repair. The United States Army built 49,000 of them between 1942 and 1945. They were good tanks, but they were not built to duel with panzers. The problem was the gun. The Sherman's 75mm cannon could penetrate 3 inches of armor at 500 yards. That was enough to kill a Panzer III. It was not enough to kill a Panzer IV from the front. And it was nowhere near enough to penetrate a Panther or a Tiger. German tank designers knew this. By late 1943, every Panzer rolling off the production line had frontal armor that could stop a Sherman shell at combat range. The Sherman's advantage was supposed to be speed, mobility, numbers. American doctrine said that 5 Shermans could overwhelm 1 Panzer through maneuver and flanking fire. The math worked on paper. In reality, it meant that 4 out of 5 Sherman crews died trying to get into position for that flanking shot. Crews called it the death ratio. For every German tank destroyed in France during the summer of 1944, the Allies lost 4 Shermans, sometimes 5. At Villers-Bocage in June, a single Tiger tank destroyed 25 Allied tanks in 15 minutes. At Goodwood in July, British tank units lost 200 Shermans in 1 day trying to push through German lines south of Caen. The crews knew the odds. Every tanker in France had seen burned-out Shermans beside the roads. They had pulled wounded men from turrets. They had watched tanks brew up when Panzer rounds ignited the ammunition stored inside. A direct hit to a Sherman's turret killed the loader first. He sat right next to the ready rack where 20 shells were stored. When those shells cooked off, there was nothing left to bury. American tank commanders tried everything to even the odds. They added sandbags to the front glasses. They welded spare track links to the turret. Some crews painted their tanks with extra markings to look like command vehicles, hoping the Germans would waste shots on decoys. None of it mattered much. The Sherman's guns still couldn't punch through panzer armor from the front, and in a duel, the tank that fired first usually won. That meant speed mattered, rate of fire mattered. A Sherman crew that could load and fire faster than a panzer crew had a chance. Not a great chance, but a chance. The standard loading time for a Sherman 75mm gun was 4 to 5 seconds per round. That included grabbing the shell from the ready rack, turning to face the breech, aligning the shell, ramming it home, and stepping clear so the gunner could fire. German loaders in a Panzer IV could match that time. Panther crews were slightly slower because their shells were heavier, but the Panther's gun could kill a Sherman from twice the range, so speed mattered less. American tank schools drilled loaders on the standard method for weeks. Face the breech, 2 hands on the shell, ram straight forward. The motion was designed to be safe, repeatable, and efficient. It worked fine on a practice range at Fort Knox, where the tank wasn't moving and nobody was shooting back. But there was a problem nobody at Fort Knox had considered. What happened when the loader was left-handed? Walter Kowalski was one of 3,000 left-handed loaders in the Third Army. Nobody tracked that number officially. Nobody thought it mattered. At Fort Knox, instructors taught one loading method. Face the breech, grab the shell with both hands, ram it forward. If you were left-handed, you learned to do it right-handed. That was the rule. In a stationary tank on a practice range, that rule worked fine. In combat, it was killing people. The interior of an M4 Sherman turret measured 7 feet across at its widest point. The loader stood on the right side of the gun. The gunner sat on the left. The commander stood behind and above them both. When the gun fired, it recoiled 18 inches backward. When the turret traversed to track a target, everything inside shifted. The space was tight. Every movement mattered. A right-handed loader could grab a shell from the ready rack, pivot smoothly toward the breech, and load without hitting the gunner. His right arm naturally aligned with the breech opening. His left hand supported the shell's weight. The motion was fluid, efficient, safe. A left-handed loader faced the opposite problem. To use the standard method, he had to grip the shell with his weaker right hand leading. His stronger left hand could only support from behind. When he pivoted toward the breech, his left elbow swung wide. In the cramped turret, that elbow hit the gunner's shoulder, or the traverse wheel, or the radio mount. Every time. The result was slower loading times. Left-handed loaders averaged 5 to 6 seconds per round instead of 4. In training, instructors called it acceptable. In combat, those extra 2 seconds meant death. At Ericourt in mid-September 1944, the 4th Armored Division lost 18 Sherman tanks in the first 2 days of fighting. Most were hit before they could fire a third shot. After-action reports noted that several loaders were killed while struggling with the breech mechanism. One tank commander reported that his left-handed loader had fumbled a shell during combat and dropped it. The delay cost them 8 seconds. A Panzer round hit their turret before they could fire again. The loader died instantly. The gunner lost both legs. The problem went deeper than just left-handed loaders. Even right-handed loaders struggled with the standard method when the tank was moving. Shermans had no stabilization system for the gun. When the tank rolled over rough ground, the turret shook. The breech moved. Loaders had to time their movements to match the gun's motion. Trying to ram a 38-pound shell into a moving breech while standing in a shaking turret while someone was shooting at you required perfect coordination. Most loaders solved this by gripping the breech rim with one hand to steady themselves while loading with the other. That worked, but it meant using only one hand to control the shell. And a 75mm round weighed 38 pounds. One-handed loading was slow, dangerous. The shells sometimes slipped. When a loader dropped a shell in combat, it took 10 to 15 seconds to recover. By then, the Panzer had already fired. Tank commanders knew this. They watched their loaders struggle. They watched good men die because loading took too long. Some commanders tried to help by calling out coordinates earlier. Some tried to position their tanks so the loader had more time. But there was no official solution. The training manual said to face the breech and ram the shell forward. That was the method. Changing it was against regulations. What nobody realized was that the solution had been there all along. It just required breaking every rule in the manual. Walter Kowalski discovered his backward loading method by accident and by desperation. On September 17, 1944, 2 days before the fight that would make him famous, Walter's tank was hit during a skirmish near Reshikhor. The Panzer round struck their front glacis at an angle and deflected upward. It didn't penetrate, but the impact threw Walter against a turret wall. He hit his right shoulder hard enough to dislocate it. The battalion medic popped the shoulder back into place and told Walter he was done. Finished. A loader with a damaged right arm was useless. The standard loading method required both arms working in coordination. Walter couldn't lift 38 pounds with his right arm. He could barely move it. But 4th Armored Division was 12 tanks short of full strength. The regiment had lost 36 loaders in the past week. There were no replacements available. The tank commander, Sergeant Raymond Miller, made a choice. He told Walter to stay. They would figure something out. The next morning, September 18th, they took fire from German positions east of Ericourt. 3 Panzer IVs appeared through the morning fog at 900 yards. Sergeant Miller ordered the gunner to engage. Walter reached for the first shell with his left hand. His right arm hung useless at his side. He tried the standard method, faced the breech, attempted to lift the shell with both hands. His right shoulder screamed. The shell tilted, started to slip. The gunner was yelling at him to hurry. The panzers were closing. 800 yards now. Walter made a decision born from pure panic. He turned his back to the breech, reached behind himself with his left hand, felt for the breech opening like a blind man searching for a door handle. His fingers touched the hot metal rim. He guided the shell nose backward into the chamber, used his left arm to ram it home. The motion felt wrong, backward, dangerous. The breech mechanism caught the shell and slammed shut. The gunner fired. The recoil blast hit Walter's back. The heat seared through his uniform. He smelled burned fabric and skin. But the shell was loaded. 3.5 seconds. He grabbed the next round. Same motion. Back turned. Left hand guiding. Left arm ramming. 3 seconds. The gun fired again. The panzers were returning fire now. Shells were screaming past their turret. Walter didn't stop. 4th shell. 5th shell. His left arm was burning from the effort. The muscles felt like they were tearing, but he kept loading. The engagement lasted 4 minutes. They fired 9 rounds, hit 2 panzers. The 3rd retreated behind a tree line. When the shooting stopped, Walter's back was covered in powder burns. His left arm was shaking from exhaustion. His right arm still hung useless. Sergeant Miller climbed down from his position and stared at Walter. The gunner was staring too. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then the sergeant asked a simple question. How fast was that? Walter didn't know. He hadn't been counting. The gunner had been. He said Walter was loading in 3 seconds, sometimes less. That was faster than their previous loader, faster than anyone in their platoon, maybe faster than anyone in the battalion. Miller told Walter to keep doing exactly what he had just done. Whatever it was, however wrong it looked, it worked. But it violated every safety regulation in the field manual. The backward loading method worked because of 3 things the Army manual had never considered: leverage, space, and natural motion. When a loader faced the breech using the standard method, he had to extend both arms forward to ram the shell home. That meant pushing against 38 pounds of weight with his arms at full extension. Any mechanic knows that pushing something heavy with straight arms gives you the weakest leverage possible. It's like trying to open a stuck door by pushing with your fingertips instead of your shoulder. When Walter turned his back to the breech, he changed the physics completely. Instead of pushing the shell forward with extended arms, he was driving it backward, with his arm bent and his body weight behind it. The motion was like throwing a punch backward, short, powerful, efficient. His left arm only had to move 12 inches instead of 24, and he could use his shoulder and back muscles instead of just his triceps. The result was faster loading with less effort. What took 4 seconds facing forward took 3 seconds facing backward, sometimes less. The second advantage was space. A Sherman turret was cramped. When a loader faced the breech, his body took up 2 feet of lateral space. His elbows stuck out. His shoulders were square to the gun. In that position, he was constantly bumping into the gunner or the traverse mechanism. Every collision cost time. Sometimes it cost the shell. When Walter turned his back, his body profile narrowed. His shoulders aligned parallel to the gun instead of perpendicular. He took up maybe 10 inches of space instead of 2 feet. The gunner could work without being elbowed. The commander could lean down without hitting Walter's head. The entire crew had more room to move. The third advantage was the most important. It was about natural motion. Right-handed loaders were taught to lead with their right hand because that was their dominant hand. Made sense. But in the cramped turret, leading with the right hand meant twisting their torso to the left while reaching right. The motion was awkward. It required conscious coordination. Under stress, when adrenaline and fear took over, that coordination broke down. Loaders fumbled, dropped shells, wasted precious seconds. Left-handed loaders had it worse. They were forced to lead with their weak hand. Every motion fought against their natural instincts. Walter's backward method eliminated that problem. He reached behind himself with his dominant hand, his left hand. The motion was natural, instinctive. It didn't require thinking. Under fire, when his brain was screaming and his hands were shaking, muscle memory took over. His left hand knew where the breech was without looking, could feel the opening, guide the shell home. It was faster, more reliable, and it worked for both left-handed and right-handed loaders. A right-handed loader could use the same backward motion leading with his right hand. The method had one problem. It violated every safety rule written for Sherman tank operations. And that meant Walter couldn't teach it to anyone else without facing a court-martial. The official Army regulations for tank gunnery, Technical Manual 9-731A, were explicit about loading procedures. Loaders would face the breech at all times. They would maintain visual contact with the shell during loading. They would use both hands in coordinated motion. They would step clear of the recoil path after loading. Turning your back to a 75mm cannon violated all 4 rules simultaneously. The regulations existed for good reasons. A loader who couldn't see the breech might misalign the shell. A misaligned shell could jam the breech mechanism. A jammed breech in combat meant a dead tank. The manual cited 3 documented cases from North Africa where improper loading techniques had caused catastrophic breech failures. In one case, the explosion killed the entire crew.
Sergeant Miller knew the regulations. He also knew that Walter's method worked. After the engagement on September 18th, Miller faced a choice: report the violation and lose his best loader, or keep quiet and win fights. He kept quiet. On September 19th, the engagement that opened this story, Walter's crew destroyed 4 Panzers in 6 minutes using the backward loading method. Other tank commanders noticed. When your battalion is losing 2 tanks for every 1 you kill, you pay attention to any crew that beats those odds. By September 20th, 3 other loaders in the battalion were trying Walter's technique. By September 21st, it was 8. None of them asked permission. They just started turning their backs to the breech during combat. And they started surviving. The results were impossible to ignore. Tanks using the backward loading method were firing 9 to 10 rounds per engagement instead of 6 to 7. They were getting killing shots before the Panzers could respond. Crew survival rates jumped. 4th Armored Division's kill ratio improved from 4 to 1 against them to nearly even. But the method was spreading through whispered conversations and quick demonstrations behind the maintenance sheds. No written instructions, no official training. Just loaders teaching each other a technique that could get them court-martialed if anyone with rank noticed. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams noticed. Abrams commanded the 37th Tank Battalion. He was 30 years old and already famous for aggressive tank tactics. He had led the armored column that broke through to Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge. He would later become Chief of Staff of the Army.
But in September 1944, he was a battalion commander trying to keep his crews alive. On September 23rd, Abrams was observing a training exercise when he saw one of his loaders turn his back to the breach. The loader completed the motion in under 3 seconds. Abrams called the exercise to a halt, ordered the crew out of the tank, demanded an explanation. Sergeant Miller stepped forward, told Abrams about Walter, about the backward method, about the results, about the survival rates. Abrams listened without interrupting. When Miller finished, Abrams asked one question: "Does it work better than the manual?" Miller said, "Yes, sir. 2 seconds faster per round on average, higher accuracy under fire, fewer fumbled shells, better crew coordination in tight spaces." Abrams was silent for 30 seconds. Every tanker in the exercise area was watching, waiting to see if Miller and Walter would face charges for violating regulations. Then Abrams made a decision that would change how American tank crews fought for the rest of the war. Abrams ordered every loader in his battalion to learn the backward method. Immediately. He didn't care what the manual said. He cared about kill ratios and crew survival. If turning your back to a 75mm cannon kept his men alive, then that was the new standard. Within 48 hours, the 37th Tank Battalion was training every replacement loader on Walter's technique. Abrams brought Walter in to demonstrate, made him show the motion step by step, had experienced loaders practice until they could match Walter's 3-second time. The training was informal, no written documentation, no official modification to field procedures, just practical instruction that worked. By October 1st, 90% of the loaders in 37th Battalion were using the backward method in combat. Their average engagement time dropped from 12 minutes to 8 minutes. Their kill ratio improved to better than 1-to-1. They were losing fewer tanks, destroying more panzers, coming home alive. Other battalion commanders in 4th Armored Division noticed. They started asking Abrams what he was doing differently. He told them. Some adopted the technique immediately. Others resisted. The manual was the manual. Regulations existed for reasons. Changing field procedures without authorization from higher command was grounds for disciplinary action. But General George Patton commanded 3rd Army, and Patton cared about exactly 2 things: speed and results. When his staff showed him the after-action reports from 4th Armored Division, Patton asked one question: why weren't all his loaders doing this? On October 7th, 1944, Patton visited 4th Armored Division headquarters. He watched Walter demonstrate the backward loading method, watched 3 other loaders match the technique, timed them with his own stopwatch. 3 seconds, 2.8 seconds, 2.9 seconds. Patton turned to his chief of staff and gave a direct order. Every tank battalion in 3rd Army would adopt this loading method, immediately. Any battalion commander who refused would be relieved. Any officer who court-martialed a loader for using the backward technique would answer to Patton personally. 3rd Army had 11 armored divisions, roughly 4,000 Sherman tanks. Within 2 weeks, the backward loading method was standard practice across the entire Army. Training officers demonstrated it to replacement crews. Veteran loaders taught it to new arrivals. The technique spread from battalion to battalion through official channels now. Not whispers, not secret demonstrations behind maintenance sheds. Official adoption. The results were measurable. Between October and December 1944, 3rd Army's tank kill ratio improved from 3.2-to-1 against American forces to 1.4-to-1. Sherman crews were destroying German armor faster than the Germans could replace it. Crew survival rates increased by 18%. The backward loading method wasn't the only reason, but it was a significant factor. 1st Army and 9th Army noticed. By January 1945, loaders across the entire European theater were turning their backs to the breach. The technique reached the Pacific theater by March. Tank crews fighting in Okinawa used the same method Walter had discovered by accident in France. The Army never officially changed Technical Manual 9-731A. The regulation still said loaders should face the breach, but every experienced tank commander knew better. The manual was theory. The backward method was survival. By the time the war ended in May 1945, tens of thousands of Sherman loaders had used Walter's technique. Nobody knows exactly how many lives it saved, but the statistics suggest it was significant. What happened to Walter Kowalski tells you everything you need to know about how the Army recognized unconventional solutions. Walter Kowalski received no medal for inventing the backward loading method, no commendation, no official recognition. The Army doesn't award decorations for violating regulations, even when those violations save lives. He did receive a promotion. On October 15, 1944, Sergeant Miller recommended Walter for corporal. The promotion went through. Walter spent the rest of the war as a tank loader in the 37th Tank Battalion. He survived 14 more engagements between October and May. His tank was hit 3 times. He walked away each time. His crew destroyed 23 German tanks between September 1944 and May 1945. Walter loaded every round, used the backward method for every shot. By the end of the war, he could load a 75mm shell in 2.3 seconds, blindfolded. His hands knew the motion so completely that conscious thought wasn't required anymore. After the war ended, Walter returned to Detroit, went back to his job as a mechanic at the Ford River Rouge plant. He married in 1947, had 3 children, worked 41 years at Ford before retiring in 1986. He never spoke much about the war. Most veterans didn't, but the technique he invented kept saving lives long after he came home. During the Korean War, American tank crews used modified Shermans against North Korean T-34 tanks. The loaders were trained on the backward method at Fort Knox before deployment. Combat reports from the 1st Marine Division noted that loader speed was critical in the close-range tank duels around the Pusan perimeter. The backward loading technique gave Marine Corps Sherman crews a measurable advantage. Load times averaged 2.8 seconds compared to 4 seconds for North Korean loaders. In Vietnam, the last combat Sherman saw action with the South Vietnamese Army. By then, the tanks were obsolete, but the loading principles weren't. Crews operating M48 Patton tanks adapted the backward method for their 90mm guns. The motion worked the same way. Turn your back, feel for the breech, ram the shell home. The physics didn't change just because the gun was bigger. Even after the introduction of automatic loaders in the 1970s, variations of Walter's technique remained relevant. The M1 Abrams tank has a semi-automatic loading system, but the human loader still handles the rounds manually before they enter the automatic mechanism. Training at Fort Benning taught modified versions of the backward grip method until the late 1980s. Instructors who had served in Vietnam and knew the technique firsthand passed it down to a new generation. In 1993, a military historian researching 4th Armored Division tactics found references to the backward loading method in after-action reports. The historian tracked down Walter through veteran registries, asked him about the technique. Walter confirmed the story, said it wasn't anything special, just something he figured out when his shoulder was hurt. The historian published a paper about it, called it one of the most significant tactical innovations to emerge from frontline troops during World War II. Estimated that the technique may have contributed to saving 300 to 500 American tank crew lives, based on improved survival rates in units that adopted it. That estimate only covered the European theater between October 1944 and May 1945. It didn't account for Korea, or Vietnam, or the decades of training that followed. Walter died in 2004 at age 82. He was buried in Resurrection Cemetery in Clinton Township, Michigan. His obituary mentioned his service in World War II. It did not mention that he had changed how American tanks fought. His 3 children attended the funeral. So did 7 other men, all veterans, all former tank loaders. They had learned the technique from men who learned it from men who served with Walter in France. None of them had ever met him before that day. They came because they understood what he had given them. The backward loading method remained standard practice for tank loaders until the development of fully automatic loading systems in modern main battle tanks. Even then, crews operating older M48 and M60 tanks continued using variations of the technique through Vietnam and into the 1970s. The last American tank crews to use manual loading were early M1 Abrams tank crews, and even they were taught modified versions of the backward method during training until automation became standard. Today, you can see Walter's service record at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. The documents make no mention of the loading technique. They list his rank, unit, and dates of service, nothing more. But if you request the after-action reports from 4th Armored Division for September through October 1944, you'll find brief references to improved loading times and crew efficiency. The reports don't explain why, they just note the results. At the Patton Museum in Fort Knox, Kentucky, a restored M4 Sherman sits on display. The interior is preserved exactly as it was in 1944. The loader's position on the right side of the turret is cramped, tight. When you stand where Walter stood, you understand immediately why he turned his back. There simply wasn't room to do it any other way. The museum placard describes the Sherman's specifications: armor thickness, gun caliber, engine horsepower. It mentions that American tank crews developed innovative tactics to overcome the Sherman's disadvantages against German armor. It does not mention Walter Kowalski, does not mention the backward loading method, does not mention that sometimes the most important innovations come from scared 20-year-old mechanics trying not to die. That's how wars are won. Not by generals or tactics or superior equipment, by ordinary people making split-second decisions under fire, by mechanics who figure out better ways to load shells, by soldiers who break the rules when the rules don't work. Walter Kowalski never claimed to be a hero. He was just a left-handed kid from Detroit who couldn't use his right arm and had to find another way. It saved his life, and it saved hundreds of others. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters, each one deserves to be remembered, and we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You're part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.